In this chapter, we'll examine cognitive development as it occurs in middle childhood. So first off, we'll talk about Piaget once again, and what he termed concrete operational thought. And so that was Piaget's, term for the ability for children to reason logically about direct experiences and perceptions. So I put in a little bit right here about how the mind works, and everything. So feel free to peruse that at your own convenience. I'm not going to read through this here, but I will remind you right here, though, that the school-age child, they are no longer limited by their egocentrism, and they start to perform logical operation. And so they apply their new reasoning skills to concrete situations, hence the term concrete operational thought. So last but not least, we just, to summarize this, so what develops during middle childhood is the ability to use mental categories and subcategories flexibly, inductively, and simultaneously. So on the next slide, we'll start taking a look at some of that. So definitely putting incoming information or knowledge, whatever you like to think of that, into categories. There are basically a couple different ways that children do that. Number one is called classification. Right here, this term, classification. And that's basically just organizing things into groups according to some characteristic that they have in common. So I always like to use the example of when children, when they first get the Crayola box of 64 different crayons. And I remember that was a big deal when I was a kid. And so, a lot of those, some new colors, some things that a child has never heard of. And but they can still classify those as belonging to the same group, which is known as color. So all those crayons are just basically variations of color. Taking that a little bit further, we'll discuss the term called seriation. And all that means is knowledge that's, arranged in a logical series. So basically, as knowledge comes in, children are able to say, well, this needs to go before that, or this precedes this, or this comes after that, because that's more logical in series speaking. So, that's what's important off of this slide to know. These two terms right here. So I highly recommend you pause the slide, take some quick notes on those two terms. Now, another researcher we'll look at that you're well acquainted with at this point is Vygotsky. And you remember Vygotsky, he proposed that basically the majority of learning for all humans occurs in a social context. So instead of sitting by themselves and actually learning new things, most learning occurs in a social type context through interaction with other people. Okay, so a lot of this, you're going to already be familiar with. Remember, we talked about the zone of proximal development right here. So just that's just to kind of remind you that was Vygotsky who, proposed that idea. And so we are going to move on here and take it a little bit further, about Vygotsky and cognition. Number one, definitely, Vygotsky, he totally emphasized that socio-cultural context, is very important when it comes to learning and thinking processes, cognition. And so definitely said, in this right here, what's important to understand is Vygotsky, his idea that, sociocultural context is really important when it comes to cognition. That is highly contrasted with Piaget's ideas that, basically cognition comes from self-discovery and maturation of the cortical maturation, so the brain, maturing. So what do you think? I think this would be a very interesting topic to discuss in our discussion forums. And when it comes to discussing cognition, also an important theory here, and this is a little more contemporary actually, is psychologists have determined or proposed the idea that our brains are really similar. They actually process very similar to computers in similar ways that computers do. And this is known as information processing theory. And that's what that term refers to. Make that real simple for yourself. Information processing theory, that just means comparing the human brain to a computer. And here's the way, that computers and human brains are very similar. They seek relevant information as a search engine does. They analyze, similar to software programs, and they express conclusions so another person can understand, so as like network computer or a printout might do. So those are just some examples of how computers might be similar to the human brain. And so definitely brain scans, have shown that, this is a very useful way to look at the human brain. Comparing it to similar processes, the way computers process information. For example, children learn, step by step. They learn gradually, and they advance with neurological as neurological connections spread. So you remember, in an earlier chapter, we discussed, that definitely, parts of the axons, they actually communicate, through dendrites, to other axons, and everything. And so that's what they mean by neurological domain connection spread. So that means spreading throughout the brain, and different parts of the brain start to connect with each other. And that actually results in increased processing of information, just like a computer. And just taking that a little further, they say, just like the computer, brains, so certain hubs develop where massive numbers of axons meet, like say, for instance, reading, social skills, automation, so those are just a few examples here. And taking that just a little bit further, so extensive knowledge base, it makes it easier to master new related information. So that is what's important to realize, is definitely, the broader the base of one's knowledge, the easier it will become to master new related information. And so some of the factors that I added some notes right here, some factors influencing one's knowledge base, are like experience, opportunity, personal motivation, and, and then some of the control processes, that are important to keep in mind during this type of processing, is emotional regulation, which we've discussed in an earlier chapter, and selective attention, which we've discussed earlier. Okay, so switching gears slightly, we're going to take a look at memory. And so memory processes, what's important to understand, is they are definitely affected by brain maturation and experience. And you remember, those two are highly correlated. The more experience one gains, the more brain maturation one will experience. And vice versa, so keep that in mind. So there are three types of basic memory to understand. Sensory memory, that's what, that's the brain processing, just very quick incoming sensory information, and that only lasts for a split second or so. In one's brain. So when one sees something or hears something or feels something, that is called, and you're thinking about it, that is called sensory memory. On the other hand, though, working memory, that is what's known as short-term memory, and that is the component of information processing system in which current conscious mental activity occurs. So, in simple language, that's what you're doing right now as I'm speaking to you and you're reading this. Your working memory is actually engaged because that is actually processing the current mental activity, conscious information that is coming in at this particular moment. So working memory is what we are engaging in and using constantly as we're talking, learning, experiencing, processing. And usually that lasts for about 30 seconds, 20 to 30 seconds, usually. Now, there are ways to continue, repeating information over and over and things like that, but in generally speaking, working memory usually lasts about 20 to 30 seconds. Then if it's retained in one's working memory for that long and very thoroughly gone through, then it may possibly move into long-term memory. And that's it's basically limitless. The amount of information and for the amount of time that it can be stored. Long-term memory can be limitless, can be, and it can be stored indefinitely. Okay, so here's just a few, looking a little further into each of these types of memory. So I'm basically going to recommend you pause the video and just look at each of these, because I've already gone through all these, in what I feel is sufficient detail. But for your practice and for further insight, I highly recommend you pause and look at each of these. So here's working memory, and then, we're talking about the knowledge base and how that affects one's memory. And here's the various control processes require the brain to organize, prioritize, and direct our mental operations. And so a couple of these terms right here, executive processes or executive functions, remember that is basically what occurs in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And that is things like logical thinking, planning, basic information processing, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. There's also what's called selective attention, which you are familiar with at this point. That just means focusing one's attention on the most important things at that particular scenario or moment. Now, metacognition, this may be a new term to some of you. Metacognition, all that refers to is the process of being consciously aware of one's own thinking process. So, when one engages in the process, when one sits and just says, "What am I thinking? Why am I thinking that?" That is called metacognition. And then the same occurs with the term called meta memory. Now, meta memory, all that refers to is being aware, being conscious of how one memorizes information, one's memory processes, and maybe one's strategies for facilitating better memory or memorization of certain facts or information. So that is termed meta memory. So meta basically just means conscious awareness of. So meta, just keep that in mind. Whenever you see that at the beginning of a word, that's what that refers to. Now, just I added this little quick note, that control processes, they improve with our, as one ages, and direct and indirect experience, is definitely helps to improve that. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so switching gears, we're going to take a look at language now, because we are, remember this chapter is discussing cognition and thinking processes. And so definitely we, can't really think too well without processing language as well. And as Vygotsky mentioned in this chapter, feels that, that language processing, is first and foremost the most important thing when it comes to cognition. Okay, so first of all, I made some notes here, so when it comes to language, at this age of development, children start to be, they start to understand metaphors. So they start to comprehend, enjoy, jokes, puns, unexpected answers, to normal questions, things like that. They become more flexible, cognitively speaking, and they become a little more socially aware, so, they're able to understand, things, like jokes and, just general more flexibility in their cognition. Okay, and when it comes to talking about when speaking two or more languages, so these are with age, brains, they change to accommodate a second language, but up to that point though, when people are younger, especially in their first few years, there's really no detectable brain differences between those who speak one language and those who speak two languages. So that, but as one ages, then we start noticing there are changes in the brain that occur being multilingual. Okay, so I realize there's a lot of information on this slide. I highly recommend you pause here and just start to take a look at this. So definitely I will touch on the most important points on this slide. ELL, that means English language learners. So those are referred to as maybe those who speak a non-English language at home, but they're capable in English, well, those are not ELLs. Those are called ELS or ESL, actually, English second language learn. So I just want to kind of have you be aware. Sorry to be a little confusing there, about the difference, but ELL, that means English language learners whose proficiency in English is they might be a little bit low at that point in time, and but ESL, that refers to those who might be even though English is their second language, they are starting to develop some proficiency with. So thanks for bearing with me on that. I got a little off track there. Okay, so definitely, how does when it comes to learning a second language, what works, So what do you think? Do you think, immersion in the second language is best, where one just is totally, that's all they speak and hear all day long, every day? Do you think that's best? Do you think that the second language should be taught as a foreign tongue, or do you think that bilingual schooling is best? So, this is kind of controversial and people have different ideas on this. So what do you think about this? This might be something that might be interesting to discuss in our discussion forum. Okay, moving on. And just taking a look at just some basic educational practices, so what's important on this slide here is, right here, the types of schooling. And so there are public schools, there are charter schools, there are private schools, vouchers, there's homeschooling. And so maybe, pause and kind of think about what you know about each of these, or your personal experience or experience, that you've learned about through others that you know. And what are your thoughts on these? Now, a couple things that may, definitely, affect, the ability to learn another language, a second language, or, or more than second language. Things like definitely, family poverty, socioeconomic status, remember, so that's to consider, as well as, since we're talking about middle childhood, a couple other factors, like they may, certain children may have limited early exposure to words. So that's something to consider. So definitely as a child grows up, if they have more exposure to words, like the parents speak and use more words, or family, or things of that nature, that will help later language learning. But also teacher and parents' expectations, those are important. Those are important factors in learning a language as well. So this is just some basic broad generalizations. So we also talked we already talked about socioeconomic status and how that affects language learning. Okay. And so we've also talked about strong correlation between academic achievement and socioeconomic status. But feel free to pause and review this. And then I just included this imagery here, because, this is interesting, So literacy, that is really important. That is central to the curriculum for school children everywhere, no matter where they live, So like this, take for instance, this might occur, in different cultural contexts, sociocultural contexts. Take for instance this boy on the right, he's really reading, out of this holy book, and that is how he is practicing literacy and language learning, whereas these children, they're reading more, like children's books, short stories, things of that nature. So just more for interest. And here's a few statistics, some thoughts, about, schooling in the United States. Feel free to pause here and look at this. I'm not going to go over these in extreme detail. And this also discusses the Common Core, aspect of schooling. So what do you think about the Common Core curriculum? And that concludes our discussion on cognition as it occurs in middle childhood. And keep up your good work. And, once again, I want to remind you, the next step is to get your study guide out, start to answer some of the questions that are associated with this chapter. And also maybe review this video in order to really learn and memorize and gain insight into the key concepts. And we will see you on the next video.